She was just a housekeeper. Nameless, powerless, unseen. But tonight, in a room filled with men who could buy a nation, a trembling old tycoon rose, a shattered wineglass at his feet, and whispered a name she'd never heard before. Little Firebird. And every eye in that room, eyes that had commanded hundreds of deaths, turned to the scar on her wrist. Please like and comment the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything. The cart had a bad wheel. It had been bad for 3 weeks, and Elena Cross had reported it twice to maintenance, and both times nothing happened, so she stopped reporting it. That was the kind of place Blackbriar Grand was. The kind of place where the marble floors cost more per square foot than her monthly rent, where the chandeliers overhead dripped with crystals that had been imported from a Czech manufacturer that no longer existed, where every surface gleamed like something out of a dream, and where the employees who kept it gleaming were essentially invisible. She was used to that. She had been invisible her whole life. The bad wheel caught on a seam in the marble, and the cart lurched sideways, and a stack of folded towels slid off the top shelf and hit the floor. Elena stopped, stood there for a second with her eyes closed, breathed in through her nose. The hallway smelled like hothouse flowers and cleaning solution, and underneath both of those things, something else, something she could never quite name but always associated with money. Old money. The kind of money that didn't need to announce itself because it had been there long enough that announcement felt beneath it. She picked up the towels, restacked them, started moving again. It was 10:20 on a Thursday night, and she had been on shift since 11 that morning, and her lower back had been sending distress signals since roughly 6 o'clock, and she still had the East Corridor's 6 suites to turn down before midnight. She was 31 years old, and her knees already sounded like someone crumpling a paper bag when she crouched. She knew she should probably see a doctor about that. She hadn't. The Blackbriar Grand sat in the heart of the city like a monument to another era. All Beaux-Arts, stonework, and vaulted ceilings, and a grand ballroom on the second floor that had hosted 4 different presidents and approximately 900 private events that never appeared anywhere in the public record. Elena had worked here 4 years. She had learned early that there were 2 kinds of events at Blackbriar, the ones that got listed in the event calendar on the website and the ones that didn't. Tonight was the second kind. She could feel it in the building, the way the security density had tripled in the past 24 hours, the way the regular hotel guests had been quietly and expensively relocated to 3 other properties across the city without being told why, the way certain hallways had been blocked off with polite little placard signs that said private event, staff access only, and the way the men standing near those signs didn't look anything like hotel staff. They stood too still. Their suits fit in a specific way. Their eyes didn't move when you walked past them. Their eyes stayed fixed on whatever middle distance they'd been assigned to watch, but you got the sense that they were cataloging you anyway, running you through some internal database, making a quiet determination about whether you were a problem. Elena was not a problem. Elena was a woman with a housekeeping cart and a bad wheel and a name badge that said Elena and a face that nobody ever looked at long enough to remember. She turned the corner toward the East Corridor and nearly walked directly into Hector Voss. Hector was the hotel's head of event operations, which was a title that meant he coordinated with the private security teams during sensitive bookings, which was a title that meant he knew things about what went on in those blocked-off hallways, and he kept his mouth shut about it, which was a title that had made him visibly age about 15 years in the 4 she'd known him. He was 50-something, thick in the chest, with the permanently furrowed forehead of a man who had been managing crises so long that his face had just decided to commit to the expression full time. Right now, he looked like a man whose crisis had upgraded itself to a catastrophe. Elena. He grabbed her arm, not rough, but firm. The grip of a man who was trying to hold himself together by holding on to someone else. Mr. Voss, come with me, right now. I have the East Corridor still. Forget the East Corridor. He was already moving, his hand still around her arm, steering her away from the cart, away from the towels, away from the remaining 2 hours of her shift, which had been a bad shift but was starting to look better by comparison to whatever was happening on Hector Voss's face. I need you in the staging room. I'm housekeeping. I know what you are. Come anyway. The staging room behind the ballroom was a different world from the marble hallways. Back here it was industrial. Exposed pipes, fluorescent lights, the kind of utilitarian space that exists in every beautiful building and that the beautiful building would prefer you not know about. 3 catering staff were pressed against the far wall looking at something on the floor. And when Elena got close enough, she saw what it was. A woman, maybe 40, in a crimson evening gown that probably cost more than Elena made in 2 months, lying on her side with her eyes half open and her face the color of old paste. She just went down, one of the catering staff said. He was a young man, maybe 22, and he was talking too fast and his hands were doing something restless at his sides. 15 minutes ago, she was standing right there talking on her phone and then she just... Has anyone called? Security's handling medical, Hector said. He was already pulling at something on a rack near the wall. But medical response time is 6 minutes minimum, and I have 400 men walking through the front entrance right now. Elena looked at the woman on the floor, looked at Hector. I don't understand what this has to do with me. Hector turned around. In his arms was a second crimson evening gown, still on its hanger, wrapped in plastic. His face had gone through something in the last 30 seconds, some kind of internal argument that he'd apparently lost, because what remained was a look of desperate, uncomfortable resolution. She's the hostess, he said. The welcome ceremony starts in 11 minutes. Someone needs to stand at the top of that staircase and greet the guests. The silence in the room was very complete. No, Elena said. Elena? No, absolutely not. I'm housekeeping. I push a cart. I can't. You're the right height. He held the gown up. Margot's the right height, and you're approximately... Look, I know this is insane. I know exactly how insane this is, but right now every other woman on my team is either visible to the room already or can't fit into a size 6 evening gown, and I have 400 armed men. You keep saying 400 armed men like that's supposed to make me more comfortable with this. Who are expecting a formal welcome ceremony? And if that ceremony doesn't happen on time and in the correct format, I have been informed by the security coordination team that it will be interpreted as a breach of the neutrality protocols. And if the neutrality protocols are breached... He stopped, pressed his fingers to his forehead. I'm not supposed to tell you what happens if the neutrality protocols are breached. Great, but it's bad. I gathered. She looked at the gown, looked at Margot on the floor, who was breathing steadily now, whose color was actually coming back, who was probably going to be fine. Looked at Hector, whose entire career and possibly his safety were balanced on whatever happened in the next 10 minutes. What do I have to do? Elena said. Stand at the top of the staircase. When the doors open, you say, I have it written down. He was already reaching into his jacket pocket, pulling out a folded note card. 11 lines, that's it. Welcome and good evening, introduce the summit, invite them to take their seats. The head of security will be watching from the left side of the balcony. The lighting is designed to... The room is designed so the focus is on the staircase. You walk down slowly, you smile, you take your position at the podium and read the card. Then you step back. That's it. And no one will know I'm not her. Hector's expression shifted slightly. Something moved through it that she couldn't quite categorize. They've never met Margot. She was hired 3 days ago. She's new. You hired a hostess 3 days before this event. The original hostess had a family emergency. Elena had worked in hotels long enough to know that the word emergency, when deployed by a man like Hector, could mean nearly anything on the spectrum from genuine disaster to deliberate removal. She didn't ask which one this was. She took the gown. The dressing area was a bathroom off the staging room, and she had 9 minutes, and a catering supervisor named Grace, who had worked at Blackbriar for 11 years, and whose hands moved with the confident efficiency of a woman who had solved worse problems than this on less time. Grace got her into the gown, got her into shoes that were a half size too small. Did something quick and architectural with her hair using pins that Elena couldn't see, and a can of something that smelled like lacquer, applied lipstick the color of dark wine, stood back and looked at her. You'll do, Grace said, which was not a compliment and not an insult. It was a professional assessment, and Elena took it as one. She looked at herself in the mirror for the first time. She almost didn't recognize the person looking back. It wasn't the gown, exactly, or the hair, or the lipstick. It was something about the combination, the way the deep crimson made the darkness of her eyes more pronounced, the way her posture had shifted without her consciously choosing to shift it, the way she was standing in the body of a woman who was about to walk down a grand staircase in front of 400 of the most dangerous people currently operating on 3 continents. Her wrist itched. It did that sometimes. The scar had been there her whole life, a crescent-shaped burn mark on the inside of her left wrist, 3 inches long, old enough that she had no memory of getting it and had stopped trying to manufacture one. The orphanage had no records about it. The caseworkers had no explanation. It was just there, a piece of her history that preceded everything she actually remembered, and she had learned to treat it the same way she treated the cart's bad wheel, as a fact of her existence that wasn't going to change regardless of how many times she reported it. 2 minutes, Grace said from the doorway. Elena turned away from the mirror. The staircase was everything the ballroom deserved it to be. 22 steps of white marble with a brass railing that curved with a kind of organic elegance that suggested the architect had been given unlimited money and told to make something that would make wealthy people feel they were exactly where they were supposed to be. At the top, a pair of mahogany doors closed. Below, Elena could hear the sound of it before she saw it. The low collective presence of hundreds of people in a room, the clink of crystal, the murmur of conversations happening in at least 4 different languages. Hector handed her the note card. Left side of the podium, there's a small reading light. Your name, for the purposes of this evening, your name is Margot. My name is Elena. Tonight, I'll say the lines. I'll do the thing, but I'm not taking someone else's name. She folded the note card once and held it in her left hand. I'm Elena Cross. I'm housekeeping. I'm doing Margot a favor. He looked at her for a second, then he nodded. Then he stepped back. The doors open. Later, she would not be able to describe the precise feeling of that moment. The moment the doors pulled back and the light of the ballroom hit her, and the staircase revealed itself below her, and the room revealed itself below that. She would not be able to describe it because the thing she felt wasn't exactly fear, and it wasn't exactly anything she had a word for. It was something older than language, something her body recognized before her brain did. She took a step. The sound of the room changed. It didn't stop all at once. It stopped the way a tide goes out, gradually, then completely. First the people nearest the staircase, who looked up and went quiet. Then the ripple moving outward through the crowd, conversations dying in sequence, heads turning, crystal stopped clinking. The 4 languages dropped away one by one. And then the only sound in the ballroom of the Blackbriar Grand Hotel was the click of her heels on marble steps, and somewhere, very far away, the ventilation system doing the quiet work of keeping 400 people breathing. She kept walking. Her back was straight. She kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral, and her hands didn't shake, which surprised her because her heart rate had gone somewhere that probably wasn't medically ideal. She was halfway down the staircase when she heard the chair. The scrape of it was unmistakable. Wood on marble, at the center of the room, as someone rose to their feet. She didn't look immediately. She kept ascending. But in her peripheral vision, she registered the movement and registered the way it changed the energy in the room, because this was not a room full of people who stood without reason. In this room, standing meant something. She reached the base of the staircase, turned toward the podium, and then the sound happened. Not breaking glass. Not yet. What she heard first was silence of a different quality, the kind that falls when something unexpected has knocked the script out of a room's hands. Then the low musical shatter of crystal on marble, and she turned toward the sound involuntarily, and she saw him. He was old, 70, maybe 75, with silver hair swept back from a face that had been handsome once, and was now something more interesting. The face of a man who had survived things that would have reduced other men to component pieces. He was wearing a dark suit, and he was standing at a table near the center of the room, and at his feet was the wreckage of a wine glass, and his hands, both of them, large hands, steady-looking hands, were trembling. He was looking at her. He was looking at her the way you look at something that the rational part of your brain has told you cannot possibly be real, but some deeper, older part of you refuses to disbelieve. His mouth moved. She was 30 feet away, and the room was utterly silent, and she heard it as clearly as if he'd said it directly into her ear. Little Firebird. The sound of the name meant nothing to her. It landed in her brain and found no purchase, no memory, no association, no explanation. It was simply words in a specific combination that she had never heard directed at her before. But the room heard it too. And the room, 400 men who between them controlled more territory, more money, more violence than most governments, responded to those two words with something she'd never seen in a crowd of any size. A wave of collective recognition moving through them like a current, every face turning first toward the old man and then back toward her, every set of eyes finding the same place. And when she looked down because the attention was unbearable, she saw what they were all looking at. Her left wrist, turned outward by the way she was holding the note card. The scar visible. The crescent-shaped burn she'd had since before she could remember, catching the chandelier light. A half-moon of raised tissue that apparently meant something in this room that it had never meant anywhere else in her life. Elena Cross stood at the base of the grand staircase of the Blackbriar Grand Hotel, in a gown that belonged to someone else, holding an 11-line speech on a note card, surrounded by 400 of the most dangerous men in the world, and every single one of them was staring at the scar on her wrist. She looked up, found the old man's eyes again, and said the only thing that felt true, "I don't know who you think I am." He took one step toward her. His voice had recovered some of its steadiness, but not all of it, and the part it hadn't recovered made the words that came out of him sound like something escaping from a very long time ago. "I know exactly who you are," he said. "The question is whether you do." The old man's name was Aldrich Voss, not Hector Voss, not any kind of Voss that Elena had encountered in her 4 years at Blackbriar. Aldrich Voss was something else entirely. She could see it in the way the room arranged itself around him, the way other men who were clearly accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any given space had collectively, without discussion, yielded the center of the room's attention to this one silver-haired old man with trembling hands and broken glass at his feet. He was maybe 6 steps away from her now. He'd moved without her fully registering it. That slow, deliberate walk of a man whose body was old, but whose will hadn't gotten the news yet. The rest of the ballroom had gone so quiet that Elena could hear the ventilation system cycling and the distant sound of car traffic 8 floors below and her own pulse, which was doing something unsteady behind her sternum. "You need to back up," she said. He stopped. Something moved across his face. Not offense. More like the careful recalibration of a man who was used to people not saying that to him and who was now deciding how to process it. "I understand this is... You don't understand anything about what this is for me." She kept her voice low. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because instinct told her that whatever this was, it should not become louder. Not in this room. Not with these men. "You're looking at me like you know me. You don't know me. I'm a hotel employee. I was supposed to read 11 lines off a note card and step back." "Yes." He glanced down at the note card still folded in her left hand, back up at her face. "And yet here we are." "Here we are," she agreed. "So maybe one of us should explain to the other why 400 men are staring at my wrist." He looked around the room then, a slow, deliberate survey, the kind of look that was also an instruction. Elena watched it happen. Watched 399 faces find other things to look at, conversations reassembling themselves, the collective attention of the room folding back inward like a wave retreating. It wasn't complete. There were still eyes on her. She could feel them the way you feel weather coming, but the open scrutiny dropped away and she could breathe again. "Come," Aldrich said. "Sit with me." "I'm not sitting with you." "Then stand with me. 5 minutes. I have 11 lines to read and a corridor full of towels. The towels will wait." He turned toward a table near the east wall, away from the center of the room, separated from the nearest occupied tables by enough space to constitute something like privacy. He didn't look back to see if she was following. She followed. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because Hector was somewhere in the shadows of the upper balcony watching this happen, and probably having a cardiovascular event, and the least she could do was keep it contained. Maybe because the name the old man had said, those 2 words, had done something she didn't want to admit, had landed somewhere in her that wasn't quite her conscious mind. and she needed to understand why. She sat across from him at the small table. A server materialized and vanished, leaving water she didn't touch. Aldrich folded his hands on the tablecloth. His hands had stopped shaking. "The scar," he said. "How long have you had it?" "My whole life." "You don't remember getting it?" It wasn't a question. She answered anyway. "No. You grew up in an orphanage." Her stomach tightened. "How do you know that?" "Because 23 years ago I helped put you there." The table between them felt very small. The noise of the ballroom, reassembled now, cautious and muted but there, felt very far away. Elena looked at this man's face and looked for the thing you look for when someone says something that large. The tell, the flinch, the sign that what they've said is performance rather than fact. She didn't find it. "You're going to want to explain that sentence," she said. "Yes." He reached into his jacket, slowly, the slow, deliberate movement of a man who understood that sudden gestures in this room had consequences, and produced a folded piece of paper, set it on the tablecloth between them, didn't push it toward her, just placed it there. "But first you're going to want to see something." She didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A photograph from a newspaper, 23 years old." He paused. "The child in it has a crescent scar on her left wrist." The ventilation system cycled. Somewhere across the ballroom, someone laughed at something, a short, sharp sound that died quickly. Elena looked at the folded paper. She picked it up. Oops. The photograph was bad quality. Newsprint reproduction of what had probably already been a grainy image, the kind of picture taken under difficult conditions by someone who was more concerned with documenting than with composition. It showed the exterior of what appeared to be an industrial building, partially collapsed, surrounded by fire equipment and personnel. In the foreground, being led away by an emergency responder, was a small figure, a child, maybe 7 or 8, dark-haired, wrapped in a blanket, her face turned slightly away from the camera. On the child's left wrist, caught by the light in a way that suggested it had been wet, recently burned, recently treated, a crescent-shaped mark. Elena put the paper down. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she usually wasn't. She was aware of the tablecloth under her fingertips and the shoes that were half a size too small, and the pins in her hair, and the fact that she had been in this gown for less than an hour, and already it felt like a costume she hadn't chosen. "This isn't proof of anything," she said. "It's a photograph of a child with a scar." "No," Aldrich said. "It's a photograph from the Harwick Street warehouse fire. November, 23 years ago. 6 children died that night. 14 survived." He looked at her. The 14 who survived did so because someone unlocked the emergency exits from the inside. Someone? A child. 8 years old. The investigators couldn't identify her because by the time the building was clear she was gone. He reached across and tapped the folded newspaper, not touching her hand, not quite. The emergency responder who took that child to the triage station outside said, "She disappeared while he turned away to help another survivor. No one ever found her name." Elena didn't say anything. "Inside that building," Aldrich continued, "were the children of 6 different families, mine included. My grandson Jacob. He was 7. A pause that had weight in it. "He's 30 now. He has a son of his own." She looked up from the photograph. "Because of whoever unlocked those exits," Aldrich said. "Because of the child in that picture." The silence between them had a different texture now. Elena sat inside it and tried to locate something solid, some version of herself that was a housekeeping employee at a hotel with a bad-wheeled cart and a double shift, someone rooted in the ordinary friction of a real life. But the photograph was in her hand and the scar was on her wrist, and the old man across from her had a steadiness in his eyes that she associated, despite herself, with truth. "I want to know," she said carefully, "who put me in that orphanage. And I want to know why. And I want to know what you meant when you said you helped." Those are the right questions. "I'm not asking for a compliment. I'm asking for an answer." His mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated. "You're exactly who I thought you were. You don't know me." "No, but I know what you came from." He settled back in his chair. The ballroom murmured around them. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear in this room with these people present. And I need you to understand, whatever your reaction, you cannot show it here. Not yet. Elena thought about the men in this room, about the way the security presence had tripled in 24 hours, about the word neutrality and what Hector had said when he couldn't finish the sentence about what happened when it broke. I understand, she said. The warehouse fire wasn't an accident. It was set deliberately by someone who wanted the heirs of 6 families dead, who believed that if the next generation was eliminated, the power structure would collapse into a war that one particular faction could win. He said it without drama, the way you state facts that have had decades to become merely facts, the heat burned out of them by time. The arsonist was employed by a man named Cassian Mayer, a financier, respected, connected. He'd been operating in the background of this world for 40 years at that point. Did you catch him? We identified him, but Cassian Mayer has a gift for surviving identification. What we had was suspicion, and what we needed was a witness. He looked at her. The only witness who had been inside that building and come out alive was the child who unlocked the exits, the child who disappeared. The thing in Elena's chest that had been tightening for the past 10 minutes tightened further. Someone hit her, she said. A man named Gregor Pell, retired intelligence. He was consulting for one of the 6 families at the time of the fire. He was the one who found the girl at the triage station, recognized what she represented, what she'd seen, what it meant that she was still alive. He understood that if Cassian Mayer learned there was a witness, the girl would be dead within the week. Aldrich's voice was even, practiced even. So Gregor did what he knew how to do. He erased her. New name, new history. An orphanage in a city that had no connection to any of the 6 families. Records destroyed. Everything. He didn't ask her, Elena said. She was 8 years old. That's not an answer. A pause. Aldrich accepted it. No, he didn't ask her. She stood up. Not abruptly. She was too tired for abrupt, and too aware of the room around her. But deliberately. The way you stand when you need to create distance between yourself and something that is trying to rearrange your understanding of your own life. She walked to the window at the east wall. Outside, 8 floors down, the city moved the way it always did, indifferent and continuous. She could see her own reflection in the glass, the crimson gown, the dark eyes, the hair pinned in a shape that wasn't hers. She heard Aldrich approach behind her. He stopped a respectful distance away. I know this is not, he began. Don't. She didn't turn around. Don't manage my reaction. I don't need that. Silence. What does he look like? She said finally. Cassian Mayer. 70 years old, white hair, well kept. He runs a financial consultancy with offices in 3 countries. He has been a legitimate businessman for the last 15 years, by all public appearances. A beat. He is also in this hotel tonight. Elena's reflection looked back at her from the dark glass. He's a guest at this summit. He facilitates many of these arrangements. He's been present at 6 summits over the past decade. He is considered, Aldrich paused with something that sounded like physical discomfort, a trusted neutral party. She turned around. You've been sitting at the same table with the man who tried to kill your grandchildren. For 15 years, Aldrich said, because we couldn't prove it. Because the only person who was inside that warehouse who might have seen something that constituted evidence disappeared. Until tonight. He looked at her, not with the trembling shock of the first recognition, but with something steadier and harder. When you walked down that staircase, Cassian Mayer was standing at the bar. I saw his face change. He recognized the scar before I did. The ventilation system, the distant traffic, her own pulse. He knows I'm here, she said. He knew the moment you appeared. And you waited until now to tell me. I needed to tell you the rest first. You needed... She stopped, organized herself. How long ago was he at the bar? 20 minutes. She looked past Aldrich toward the room. The bar across the ballroom, a long mahogany structure with backlit glass shelving, had 3 people at it. None of them were a 70-year-old man with white hair. She scanned the room. really looked at it for the first time since descending the staircase, applied the kind of attention she usually reserved for ensuring no towel was left unchecked, no surface unexamined, and didn't find him. "He's not in the room," she said. Aldrich turned to look, turned back. Something shifted in his expression. Not panic, because this was a man who had apparently decided somewhere in his 7th decade to stop panicking and simply act, but a recalibration. The same thing she'd seen earlier, faster this time. "No," he said. "He isn't." Hector found her 7 minutes later. He came through the service entrance at the east side of the ballroom. She saw the door open in her peripheral vision and recognized his walk before she recognized his face, the specific gait of a man carrying too much and trying not to show it. He reached her in 12 steps, which he covered at a pace that was technically not running. "We have a problem," he said very quietly, directly into her ear. "I'm aware we have a problem. Not this problem." He glanced at Aldrich with an expression that was trying to be professional and landing somewhere closer to naked alarm. "A different problem." "How different?" "3 of my security staff in the West Service corridor are not responding to check-ins. All 3 of them went off-comm in the last 11 minutes. He looked at her. "That corridor connects the loading dock to the main building systems." Elena felt something clarify in her chest, the kind of clarification that isn't pleasant but is useful, the same thing she imagined happened in people who ran toward emergencies instead of away from them, the narrowing of all the competing inputs into the one thing that mattered. "The building systems," she said. "What's in there?" "Electrical. HVAC. A pause. "Fire suppression." She looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at her. In his face, she watched the same clarification happen. The old man reading the shape of what was forming, his jaw setting, 23 years of suspended consequence arriving all at once in the middle of a hotel ballroom. "He's not running," Elena said. "He's not leaving." "No," Aldrich said. He's going to finish what he started." Aldrich's voice was very quiet, very steady, the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed for a moment they hoped would never come. 23 years ago, he couldn't kill the children. Tonight, he has the parents. Hector was looking between them with the expression of a man who had agreed to manage a private event and was now understanding in real time that the event had become something for which there was no line on his job description, no protocol in his binder, no call he could make that would result in the kind of help this room needed in the next. He looked at his watch. In however long they had. "How many people in this building?" Elena said. "Guests? 412. Staff? 107. He swallowed. "Plus security teams." "Where are your maintenance tunnels?" Hector stared at her. "The maintenance tunnels," she said. "Every building this size has them. Access routes between building systems, separate from the service corridors." She didn't know how she knew that. She had said it before she thought about whether she knew it, the way you sometimes speak before you understand that you're speaking. "Where are they?" "East basement," Hector said slowly. "The utility infrastructure runs east-west under the main building." Elena nodded. Something in her had gone very quiet and very certain, the same way it went right before she decided to do something she couldn't take back. "Show me," she said. "Elena." "Hector." She turned to look at him fully. "Show me the tunnels." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the room around them, at 412 guests in formal wear who were eating and drinking and conducting the careful negotiations of powerful people who had temporarily agreed to not kill each other, and then looked back at her. "Okay," he said. She started for the service entrance, stopped, turned back to Aldrich, who was standing at the east window with his hands folded behind his back, watching her with an expression she couldn't name but recognized as something that had been waiting a long time. "The nun you mentioned," she said. "With the lockbox. Where is she?" Aldrich's eyes sharpened. "How do you know about—" I don't know anything yet." She was already moving again. "But whoever erased me left something behind. Gregor Pell left something behind. And if someone has it, I need to know before I walk into a basement tunnel with a man I met 2 hours ago while wearing a dead woman's shoes." She pushed through the service door. Behind her, she heard Aldrich begin moving. the unhurried, deliberate steps of a man who had made his decision and was going to see it through regardless of what it cost him, and heard him speak, quietly, to someone on a phone she hadn't seen him produce. "Find Sister Margaret," he said. "Bring her now. Use the east entrance." The door closed behind Elena. The corridor was fluorescent lit and smelled like industrial cleaner, and somewhere ahead of her Hector was already moving fast, his footsteps sharp against the concrete floor, and the building around her was doing what buildings did, breathing through its vents, humming through its walls. But she was listening to it differently now. The way you listen to something you understand is about to change, because it knows something is wrong before you do. The maintenance tunnel entrance was a steel door at the base of a concrete staircase, and Hector had a key card for it, and the key card worked, which meant whoever had gone into the West Service corridor had either used a different access point or hadn't gotten here yet. Elena filed that information away, held it alongside everything else she was holding, the photograph, the name Cassian Mayer, the empty space at the bar where a 70-year-old man with white hair had been standing 20 minutes ago, and kept moving. The tunnel itself was narrow, wide enough for two people walking side by side if neither of them minded the contact, which Elena did. So she walked slightly ahead of Hector with her left hand trailing the concrete wall, because the lighting down here was the kind that industrial spaces get when the people making decisions about lighting don't actually spend time in the space. Every third fluorescent tube was doing something uncertain, not quite flickering, not quite steady. The effect was a kind of visual stutter that made the shadows move at the edges of your vision and required a specific effort of will to keep your attention on the center of the tunnel rather than the periphery. "How far does it run?" she said. "East-west, the full length of the building, maybe 200 meters. Hector's voice had lost the event coordinator quality it carried upstairs. Down here, he sounded like what he probably actually was, a man who had spent 20 years managing things he couldn't talk about and had developed a specific kind of competence that lived below his official job title. There are 3 access points to the building systems. Electrical is first, about 60 meters in. HVAC and fire suppression are further east." "The fire suppression," she said. "If someone disabled it, the system has a manual override in the main electrical room. If the override is activated, suppression cuts out building wide." He paused. "You'd need the access code. Or you'd need to bypass the panel entirely." "That's not—" He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. He was doing the calculation she'd already done. "That's not something a hotel intruder does. That's something someone with advanced knowledge does." "Someone who'd been in this building before," she said, "or someone who'd had access to the building schematics." Hector looked at the wall. She watched him work through it, the specific ugly arithmetic of realizing that a breach of this kind required inside information, and that inside information meant inside access, and that inside access meant someone who was either currently employed by the hotel or had been recently enough to have what they needed. "How long has your maintenance chief been with the property?" she said. His face answered before he did. 8 months, he said. "Who hired him?" "The hire went through the standard—" He stopped again. "The staffing coordinator processes outside hires, cross-references with the event calendar for sensitive booking periods." He looked at her. "The staffing coordinator has access to the full building schematic as part of the onboarding documentation." "What's his name?" "Darren. Mikhail Darren." "Where is he right now?" "He should be." Hector reached for the radio clipped to his belt, keyed it. "Darren, this is Voss. What's your current location?" Static. He tried again. "Darren, respond." More static, and then something that wasn't static. A brief sound, the kind of sound a radio makes when someone keys it on the other end, and then thinks better of speaking. Then silence. Elena turned and kept walking. The first access door was marked electrical, authorized personnel in stenciled yellow paint, and it was ajar. Not open. Ajar. The specific 2-inch gap of a door that had been pushed closed by someone who didn't want it to look open from a distance, but hadn't wanted to risk the sound of the latch engaging. She put her hand flat on the concrete wall beside the door. Stopped. Listened. Nothing from inside. Or not nothing. The constant low hum of electrical infrastructure, which was its own kind of noise, the kind that had frequencies in it that you felt in your back teeth, but underneath it, or alongside it, nothing that moved or breathed. She pushed the door open with the flat of her palm. The electrical room was large, larger than the tunnel suggested, opening up into a space maybe 15 feet square, lined with panels and conduit, everything labeled in the standardized shorthand of building systems. A steel workbench against the far wall. And on the floor, near the workbench, two men in hotel security uniforms lying face down with their hands zip-tied behind them. She crossed to them, crouched. Her knees made the paper crumpling sound, and checked the nearest one. Breathing, pulse present. A lump on the back of his skull the size and color of a plum. The second man was in similar condition. "They're alive," she said. Hector was already on the radio, different channel, calling for medical to the east basement. She stood up and looked at the main panel. Something had been done to it. She could see it without knowing exactly what she was seeing, the way you can tell a lock has been picked even if you've never picked one. A panel cover removed and replaced at a slightly wrong angle, fresh scratches on two of the breaker positions. "The override," she said. "Has it been activated?" Hector came to look. He knew what he was seeing better than she did. He stared at the panel for 3 seconds. "Not yet," he said, but it's been set up. Whoever did this staged it. They can activate the override remotely now. Sir, they don't need to come back to this room." He turned, "which means they're somewhere else in the building. And the fire suppression goes down the moment they send the signal." She thought about the rooftop, about a building with no suppression system and 400 people in formal wear and one exit staircase per wing. She thought about a warehouse 23 years ago. "Call your security chief," she said. "Not on radio, your phone. Tell him to get every non-essential person moving toward the east stairwell, quietly, no announcement. If I do that without authorization from the event security coordination team, Hector," he looked at her, "make the call." He made the call. She found the lockbox in the last place she expected to find it, which was in the arms of a woman she hadn't expected to find at all. The east basement had a secondary access staircase, a narrow concrete shaft that connected the tunnel level to the hotel's service entrance on the ground floor. And at the base of it, seated on the bottom step with a weathered metal box in her lap, and both hands folded on top of it, was a woman in her late 60s, small-framed, gray-haired, cut close to her head, wearing the kind of plain dark clothing that had no institutional affiliation visible but carried the posture of someone who had spent decades in institutional service of one kind or another. She looked up when Elena appeared at the end of the tunnel. Her eyes were very clear and very tired in the way that suggested the tiredness was not from tonight, but from a much longer accumulation. "You're the girl," she said. "I'm Elena Cross." "Yes." The woman looked at her steadily. "That's the name Gregor gave you." She didn't stand. She adjusted her grip on the lockbox. Not protective, more like a habit, the way you hold something you've been holding for a long time. "He told me, if the time ever came, if someone from one of the families ever found the girl, I was to bring this." She looked at the box. "He died 4 years ago. I've been waiting to see if the time came." "Tonight it came," Elena said. "Yes." The woman stood. She was shorter standing than she'd looked seated, 5'2" maybe, with the compact self-containment of someone who had decided somewhere in her life to take up as little space as possible. She held the box out. Elena took it. It was lighter than she expected. The metal was old, slightly corroded at the corners, with a latch that had been opened and reclosed many times. She could see the wear pattern around it. She worked the latch. It was stiff, but it wasn't locked. Inside, a pendant. Silver, or it had been silver. It was partially melted, one side of it fused into an irregular shape, but the basic form was still visible. A small oval with a stylized bird etched into the surface. Next to it, folded carefully, a newspaper clipping. And underneath both of those things, a photograph. Not newsprint, an actual photograph. A print. The color slightly faded, but the image still clear. A child, maybe 7 or 8. Dark hair. A scar on her left wrist, visible because her arm was extended, reaching for something outside the frame. The child's face was turned toward the camera, and the expression on it was one Elena had never seen in a photograph of a child. Not frightened, not happy, not performing any of the things children perform for cameras. It was the expression of someone assessing a situation, measuring it, deciding. She had seen that expression recently. In the mirror, in the dressing room, in the 30 seconds before she walked through the mahogany doors. She closed the box. The woman on the stairs was watching her. "You don't remember any of it," she said. "The fire." "No." "Gregor said you might not. He said the mind sometimes—" She stopped. "He said some things are stored differently." "What was my name? Before?" A pause. "Nadia. Nadia Voss." The tunnel was very quiet. "Voss," Elena said. "Aldrich's daughter," the woman said. "You were taken by your mother when you were 3 years old. She was afraid of what the family was. She ran." A breath. "She died in an accident when you were 7. You were in the car. You survived. There was no documentation connecting you to the Voss family because your mother had spent 4 years removing every trace of it." The woman's voice was careful, even. The voice of someone delivering something they have rehearsed many times and still find difficult. "When you ended up at the warehouse that night, you were there because a caseworker had placed you in temporary shelter with a family connected to one of the other syndicates. You were 8 years old and nobody knew whose child you actually were." Elena set the lockbox on the tunnel floor. She needed both hands free, and she wasn't sure why yet. Her body was making the decision before her mind caught up, the same way it had made the decision to follow Aldrich, to take the gown, to ask about the tunnels. "Aldrich," she said, "he recognized me tonight. He recognized the scar. His wife, your grandmother, had the same mark, a family trait." The woman paused. "He didn't know you existed until your mother took you. By the time he learned you'd survived the accident, you were already gone. Gregor hid me from him too. Gregor hid you from everyone. That was the point." She met Elena's eyes. "He believed that if any of the families knew you were Aldrich's granddaughter, the conflict over custody would have been worse than the war he was trying to prevent. So he hid you from all of them equally." Elena looked at the ceiling of the tunnel. The fluorescent light above her was one of the uncertain ones, not quite flickering, not quite steady, and it gave the concrete above her a quality that she associated, in this moment, with the specific feeling of a room before a storm breaks. Her left wrist itched. She thought about Aldrich's face when she'd walked down the staircase, the wine glass, the trembling hands, the name he'd said in a voice that sounded like something escaping from 23 years of enclosure. She thought about the way he'd looked at her across the small table, the steadiness, the patience. She thought about the man who wasn't at the bar anymore, Cassian Mayer, white-haired and legitimate and trusted, and somewhere in this building right now with a signal he could send and a suppression system he could cut and 400 people who had no idea what was. The light in the tunnel went out. Not uncertain. Out. Every fluorescent along the full visible length, and the secondary staircase behind the older woman, and the red glow of the exit sign above the east access door. All of it. Gone. Simultaneous. Absolute. Darkness. Elena didn't move. Didn't make a sound. She counted. 1 breath, 2, 3. And let her eyes do what eyes do when you give them a second. Find the edges of things. Find the variations in the dark. Find the thin line of light that was coming from somewhere that the cut power hadn't reached. It was coming from under a door, 30 feet ahead in the tunnel. A door she hadn't noticed because it was set slightly into the wall and she'd been focused on the electrical room. She heard Hector's radio crackle to life behind her. Heard his sharp intake of breath. Heard him say, very quietly, "The East Wing breakers just went." Then she heard something else. Footsteps. Above them. On the floor directly overhead, which meant she was oriented in the building, she knew approximately where she was, which meant the main ballroom corridor. Multiple sets. Moving fast and in a pattern that wasn't guests. "How many stairwells?" she said into the dark. "What? In the building? How many working stairwells?" 4, Hector said. 2 in each wing. She heard him stop, heard him process. "The east stairs run directly above us. If someone controls the east stairs," she said, "they control access between the ballroom floor and everything above it." "The roof," Hector said. "The helipad is on the roof." She was already moving toward the thin line of light. The door was unlocked. She registered that wrongness before she opened it. An unlocked door in a secured maintenance tunnel, in a building currently experiencing a coordinated access breach, with the power cut to the east wing and the fire suppression staged for remote activation. An unlocked door meant either negligence or invitation, and she was no longer in a building that was making negligence errors. She pushed it open anyway. The space on the other side was a maintenance equipment room, larger than the electrical room, shelving units along 3 walls stocked with the accumulated paraphernalia of building upkeep, and in the center of the room, under a battery-powered work light that had clicked on when the main power dropped, 2 men and something she needed 5 full seconds to process. One of the men was Mikhail Darin. She knew him by description, late 40s, heavy through the shoulders, a maintenance chief's bearing, and he was seated in a folding chair with his hands free and his posture relaxed, which told her everything she needed to know about which category he fell into. The other man she had never seen before. Younger. Standing near the shelving with his arms crossed and his weight distributed in the way that people with tactical training distribute their weight when they're waiting for something to happen and they want to be ready when it does. And on the shelving behind the younger man, stacked in a configuration that Elena's brain processed in the way it had processed things all evening, before she understood how she knew what she was looking at, were 6 devices, each the size of a shoebox, each connected to the others by a single wire running in sequence. She understood the configuration. She understood it the way she'd understood the tunnel layout, the way she'd understood the building systems, the way she'd understood what Hector meant when he said fire suppression, with a comprehension that lived below conscious memory in some bedrock part of her that had never been erased, only buried. These were not the components of a remote override. This was the thing itself. The actual thing, not a signal that would cut the suppression system. A detonation array that would make the suppression system irrelevant. Harwick Street. 23 years ago. A warehouse. The same pattern. "Close the door," Darin said. His voice was flat and professional, the voice of a man completing a task. He was looking at her without surprise, which was its own answer to a question she hadn't gotten around to asking yet. "And please don't do anything that requires Soren to hurt you." The younger man, Soren, unfolded his arms. She didn't close the door. She stayed in the frame, which was a compromise between the competing instincts of run and don't show that you want to run, and she kept her eyes on Darin because he was the one talking, and the one talking was usually the one making decisions. "Where's Mare?" she said. Something moved in Darin's expression. Not surprise, more like an adjustment, the recalibration of someone who expected a particular kind of conversation and is getting a different one. "You know the name," he said. "I know several names tonight. It's been a long shift." She looked at the devices on the shelf, looked back at Darin. "Those aren't set to go off remotely." "No." "Timer." "Yes." "How long?" He looked at his watch. 17 minutes. She did the arithmetic. 14 floors of hotel, 412 guests, 107 staff, 3 working stairwells if someone was controlling the east. No. 2 working stairwells because if they'd staged this correctly, and the level of preparation she'd seen tonight suggested they'd staged it correctly, they'd have the west stair covered too, which meant 1 stairwell for 519 people in 16 minutes now. "You can't get everyone out," Darin said. He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with cruelty. He said it the way you state a logistical fact. That's not the goal. The goal is for you to understand that what happens next is already decided, and your involvement changes nothing except your own outcome. My own outcome. You leave now, through the door you came in, you take the woman in the tunnel and the hotel manager, and you get clear of the building. He folded his hands in his lap. Mare's instruction is that you're not a target. You never were. You're irrelevant to the objective. She looked at him. "I'm Aldrich Voss's granddaughter," she said. A pause. Brief, but present. "You're a hotel housekeeper." "I'm both." She kept her voice steady. "And Aldrich Voss is in that ballroom, which makes me extremely relevant to the objective, and you know it, which means Mare lied to you about what my outcome is supposed to be, or you're lying to me, or both." She took 1 step into the room. So let's skip the part where you tell me to leave because I'm not going to leave, and you know I'm not going to leave, and we're burning. She looked at the devices on the shelf. 15 minutes arguing about it. Soren moved. He was fast, genuinely fast, the fast of someone who had trained for it rather than just expected it. And he covered the distance between them in a way that didn't give her time to do anything technical or considered. What she did instead was what her body did, which was drop her weight and turn her shoulder into him and let his momentum carry him past her rather than through her. And then she was behind him and the door frame was in front of her, and she put both hands on his back and shoved him through the door into the tunnel. He hit the opposite wall, not hard enough to stop him. She knew that even as she did it, she didn't have the weight for hard enough, but hard enough to buy 3 seconds. She grabbed the door and pulled it shut. There was no lock on this side. She turned to Darren, who had stood up from his chair. He was bigger than she'd registered from across the room. He was between her and the devices. 15 minutes, she said. 14, he said. Then we should talk fast. She could hear Soren in the tunnel, recovering, reorienting. The door had no lock, but it opened inward, and if she could get to the other side of Darren, past him to the shelving, she could potentially reach the first device in the sequence, and if she could interrupt the sequence... "You don't know what you're doing," Darren said. He was moving to the left, which meant he was trying to cut off the angle to the shelving, which meant he understood what she was thinking, which meant she had about 2 seconds before the angle closed. She went right instead, not toward the shelving, toward Darren himself, which was the thing he wasn't expecting because it was the wrong direction. And it was also, objectively, a bad idea. And she did it anyway because her mother had driven her out of a life she'd been born into when she was 3 years old to keep her safe. And Gregor Pell had erased her name to keep her safe, and she had spent 31 years being kept safe by people who made decisions for her. And she was done with. It went wrong in the first 2 seconds, and right in the next 3. Darren was big, and he was trained, and he closed the distance between them before she'd fully committed to the direction. And what she got for going right was his forearm across her collarbone and her back against the shelving unit with enough force that something on the shelf above her head tipped and fell and shattered on the concrete floor beside her foot. Her teeth clicked together. Her vision did something brief and unpleasant. She tasted copper at the back of her throat and understood that her head had contacted the shelving on the way into it. But she was next to the devices. That was the right part. She didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on Darren, who had her pinned with his forearm and was reading her face for what she was going to do next, the way people with his kind of training read faces, cataloging the micro-expressions that precede movement. So she gave him nothing. She kept her face neutral, which took a specific kind of effort when someone had your collarbone compressed, and your back was against industrial shelving, and your head was ringing, but she did it, and while she was doing it, her right hand was moving along the shelf behind her. She found a wire. She didn't pull it yet. She held it between 2 fingers. A thin wire, the connecting wire she'd seen running between the devices in sequence. And she waited for Darren's eyes, which had been on her face, to flick downward to check what her hand was doing. They did. Just for a second. She drove her left elbow upward into the underside of his jaw. It wasn't a good elbow. She didn't have the angle for a good elbow. But it moved his head up and back, and his forearm pressure dropped for the half second she needed, and she used the half second to pull the wire. The connection between the first and second device separated. She didn't know what that did to the timer sequence, interrupted it, or just isolated the first device, or nothing useful at all. But she knew that a chain detonation required an intact chain, and the chain was no longer intact, and that was something. Darren hit her. It was a controlled strike. Not a wild swing. The controlled strike of someone who had decided to stop being restrained, the flat of his hand against the side of her head, and the world went sideways. She went down on one knee. The concrete floor was very cold through the thin fabric of the gown. Her left ear had stopped working correctly, everything on that side muffled, replaced by a high tone that she understood was going to be her companion for the next several hours if she made it through the next several minutes. Behind her, the door opened. Soren. She hadn't forgotten about Soren. She'd been hoping the door would buy more time than it had. It hadn't. "The wire's cut," Darren said. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Soren, which told her the wire mattered, which told her she'd done something real. Check the third device. The sequence may have rerouted through the secondary trigger. Soren moved past her toward the shelving. She was on one knee between them. She recognized, in an objectively terrible position. One large man behind her, one large man in front, a ringing ear, a head that was doing something unreliable, a gown that cost more than her monthly rent, that was now torn at the left shoulder, and approximately 12 minutes before the devices on the shelf, interrupted or not, did what they were designed to do. She got up. Not elegantly, not the way it happens when the situation allows for elegance. She got up the way you get up when getting up is the only option, using the shelving unit for leverage and the specific anger of a woman who has spent 31 years being moved around like a piece on someone else's board and is not willing to spend the next 12 minutes the same way. The secondary trigger, she said to Darren's back. He was watching Soren at the shelf. That means you have a backup detonation path, which means cutting the wire on the primary sequence only buys time. Darren turned to look at her. He had the expression of a man revising his assessment of something. "How long does the reroute take?" she said. "You should leave," he said. "I mean that." "How long?" 8 minutes, approximately. He looked at her. "Which gives you 4 minutes to get to a stairwell. Or," she said, 4 minutes to find the secondary trigger and cut that too. "You don't know where it is." "No, but you do." She held his gaze. "And you're looking at it." He wasn't, quite, but his eyes had done something. A small, involuntary movement, less than a second, toward the left side of the room, away from the shelving, toward a gray metal junction box mounted low on the wall, the kind of box that existed in every industrial space, and that you stopped seeing after a while because your brain categorized it as infrastructure and moved on. She ran for the junction box. Soren came off the shelving toward her, and Darren moved at the same time. And what happened in the next 4 seconds was not a fight in any cinematic sense. It was a collision of bodies in a small space with bad lighting. And Elena came out of it with a split lip and a bruised forearm, and her fingers on the junction box latch. And Soren came out of it face down on the concrete floor because he'd slipped on the broken ceramic from the shelf, and his knee had found it wrong. And Darren came out of it 2 steps behind her, reaching. She got the latch open. Inside the junction box was a secondary relay panel, smaller than what was on the shelf, but wired into it, the backup nervous system of the detonation array. She couldn't identify which component was the trigger without more time than she had, and Darren's hand was on her shoulder, so she did the thing that was available to her. She pulled everything. Every wire she could reach, both hands, indiscriminate, pulling until things came loose from terminals, and the relay panel went from a powered state to something that looked like the aftermath of a decision. Darren pulled her back by the shoulder, hard enough that she spun and went down again. She hit the floor, stayed there for a second, not because she wanted to, but because her legs made a decision independent of her brain. She put her palms flat on the concrete and breathed. 2 breaths, 3, and listened to the devices on the shelf, which were doing nothing. No tone, no cycle. No indication of countdown or sequence or imminence. Nothing. "How long?" she said to the floor. Nobody answered. She looked up. Darren was standing over her, and his face had moved through something in the last 30 seconds. The professional flatness was still there, but something else had come up underneath it. Something that might have been the beginning of a problem with what he was doing, or might have been nothing. She couldn't tell. She was too tired, and her ear was still wrong, and she didn't have the bandwidth left for reading faces. "How long before it reroutes again?" she said. "Or is it done?" A pause. "It's done," he said. The secondary was the last path. She stayed on the floor. "So they're not going off?" "Not tonight." He stepped back. Looked at Soren, who was getting up slowly with one hand on his knee. Looked at the junction box, open on the wall, wires hanging out of it like something that had been turned inside out. "Not with this array." "But Mare has others." Darren didn't answer that, which was an answer. She got up off the floor. Yet, Hector was in the tunnel. He'd been there. She could see from his face that he'd heard most of it through the door and hadn't come in, and she understood that was the right decision. That a hotel events coordinator without tactical training entering a room with 2 trained men was not a useful variable, but understanding it didn't make seeing his face easier. He was the color of old paper. "The devices are inactive," she said. "Elena, the building is still at risk. The suppression system is still staged. We need to get to the roof." She kept walking, back the way they'd come, toward the east staircase access. "Mayor is up there." "We don't know." "He's not in the ballroom. He's not at the bar. The helipad is on the roof, and the roof is the extraction point if the devices had gone off and he needed to leave the building before the emergency response arrived." She didn't slow down. Her shoulder hurt. Her ear hurt. The pins in her hair had partially given way, and something cold and wet was running down the side of her face from the point of impact with the shelving, and she understood it was blood, and she filed it with everything else. "He's been in this business for 40 years. He doesn't leave without confirmation, and he can't get confirmation because the devices didn't fire, which means he's still waiting." "Elena." Hector grabbed her arm. "Stop. Just stop for 2 seconds." She stopped, turned. He looked at her face, at whatever the blood was doing to the left side of it. His expression did something she didn't want to analyze. "You cannot go up there alone," he said. "I'm not asking for your permission." "I know you're not. I'm telling you that going up there alone is—" He stopped. "I'm calling Aldrich Voss." "Call him," she said. "Tell him to meet me at the roof access." She pulled her arm free and kept moving. But the stairwell from the basement to the roof was 14 floors of emergency concrete, and she took them at a pace that her body registered as a formal complaint after the 3rd floor and an active grievance after the 7th. The gown was wrong for stairs. It had a narrow skirt that required either small, quick steps or holding the fabric up, and she held it up, which meant 14 floors with one hand occupied and the railing on the other side, and the hard sound of borrowed heels on concrete echoing up the shaft above her. On the 9th floor landing, she stopped, pressed her back against the wall, breathed. Her left ear had come back partially, the high tone lower now, the muffled quality thinning. The blood on the side of her face had dried enough to stop moving. Her collarbone was doing something specific and unpleasant every time she breathed deep, and she made herself breathe deep anyway because she needed the oxygen and she needed to know the exact geography of what was hurt. Collarbone intact, probably. Soft tissue. The split lip had stopped. The head was... She probed at the contact point with her fingertips and felt a swelling that was already substantial and would be impressive by morning if she had a morning. She kept climbing. At the 12th floor, she heard something above her. She stopped, listened. A voice. One voice and then a response. A second voice. Lower and then silence. 2 people at least. At the roof access level or just below it. She took the last 2 flights slowly. Heel to toe, weight forward, the shoes cooperating for once with her wishes. At the 14th floor landing, the stairwell ended at a steel door with a push bar and a small porthole window set into it at eye height. She looked through the window. The roof of the Blackbriar Grand was organized space. Not the raw utility of the building's infrastructure, but a maintained surface with designated areas. The helipad marked in faded yellow paint to the north end, ventilation housings arranged along the east and west perimeters, and in the center, elevated on a service platform, the primary HVAC housing for the building's upper floors. The storm that the city had been threatening all week had arrived in the way storms do when they've been patient, fully and without announcement, the wind across the roof visible in the way it moved, horizontal sheets of rain catching the ambient glow of the city below. 3 men on the roof, 2 near the helipad, positioned. 1 standing at the center near the HVAC housing. The one at the center was white-haired and well-dressed, and even from this distance, through rain and glass, she understood it was him. She pushed the door open. The wind took it immediately, yanked it outward with a force that she'd underestimated, and the sound of it, steel on concrete, crossed the roof like a signal, and all 3 men turned. She stepped onto the roof. The rain hit her, and the wind hit her, and the cold of the 14th floor above a city in a storm hit her all at the same time, and the gown went flat against her in a way that made movement harder, and she stood there anyway because there was nowhere else to stand. Cassian Mayer looked at her across the distance of the roof. The 2 men near the helipad moved. She didn't run. She walked, forward, toward Mayer, toward the center of the roof, because the helipad was behind her relative to him, and if she moved forward, she reduced the angle his men had to flank her. It was basic geometry. She did it on instinct and understood the geometry after the fact. "Stop," one of the men said. She didn't stop. "Elena." Mare's voice carried through the wind with the specific quality of a voice that had spent decades being heard in difficult conditions. Not loud, projected. The distinction mattered. "You've had an extraordinary evening." "So have you." She stopped 15 feet from him, rain on her face, her hair running down the back of her neck, soaking through the crimson fabric. "Your devices are inactive. The secondary relay is gone. Whatever you built in that basement isn't going to fire." Something moved in his expression, controlled but present. "Darren," he said. "He's in the basement." A pause. "He let me do it." The controlled expression shifted slightly more. "Darren has been with me for 11 years. 11 years is a long time to do something you've decided is wrong." She held his gaze. "Or maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe he fought harder than I think he did." She let that land. "Either way, the devices are done." He was quiet for a moment. The rain moved between them, continuous and indifferent. "You understand," he said, "that this changes the immediate situation, but not the larger one. You are on a roof in a storm. My 2 colleagues are armed, and the families downstairs," he glanced toward the rooftop door she'd come through, "are still at a summit that I have been facilitating for 15 years. My relationships in that room are not erased by one failed evening." "No," she agreed. "They're not. So what exactly is it you think you've accomplished?" She didn't answer that immediately. She was listening. Through the wind, through the rain, through the low complaint of the HVAC housing, for the thing she'd been listening for since the 9th floor landing. And she heard it. The rooftop door. Opening. Not the door she'd come through. The second access door, west side, the one she'd identified from the roof layout, because every building this size had 2 roof access points, and she had mapped it in her head on the way up the staircase, because that was what she did now. Apparently, she mapped buildings, she understood systems, she walked into burning rooms. The west door opened and Aldrich Voss came through it. Not alone. Behind him, 4 men. Then 6. Then she lost count because they were moving fast and spreading across the roof in the practiced way of people who had done things like this before and knew how much space they needed. And the 2 men near the helipad made a decision, and the decision was visible in their bodies before they acted on it. The shift of weight, the reach. "Don't!" Aldrich said. His voice crossed the roof the same way Mare's did. Projected, not loud. The voice of a man who had been the most dangerous presence in rooms for 40 years and had not lost the habit. The 2 men near the helipad stopped. Mare turned to face Aldrich. And the thing that happened between them then, the thing that crossed the distance of the roof in the rain and the wind, with 6 armed men behind Aldrich and 2 behind Mare and Elena standing between all of them, was not words. It was older than words. It was the specific weight of 2 men who had occupied the same world for decades and had been moving toward this particular moment the entire time, and had both known it and had both been waiting to see which of them blinked first. Mare looked at Elena. "His granddaughter," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He looked back at Aldrich. Something crossed his face, but not fear. She didn't think it was fear, but something adjacent to it. The emotion of a man who has been running a very long calculation and has just reached the end of it and found the answer is not what he expected. "Cassian." Aldrich's voice was conversational, which was, Elena understood, the most dangerous register it could be. "You've been at my table for 15 years. "I have. You tried to kill my grandchildren 23 years ago." "I tried to end a war before it started," Mare said it evenly. "Children become heirs. Heirs become weapons. I've watched it happen 6 times across 40 years. And tonight was a correction. The families have consolidated too much. The balance, Aldrich said the word the way you pick up something broken and hold it up to show someone what they've done. 400 people, Cassian. Half of them have nothing to do with the families. Staff, coordinators." A pause. "Housekeeping." Mare looked at Elena again. She looked back at him. In his face, she saw the shape of what he was. Not a monster, which would have been easier, but a man who had made a decision 40 years ago about how the world worked and had never revised it, who had built an entire architecture of rationale around that decision, and who had arrived at tonight as the logical conclusion of everything that had come before, as convinced of his own correctness as he had ever been, and as wrong. "There's nowhere to go," she said to him. "The roof is covered. The basement is done. And in about 3 minutes, the people in that ballroom are going to know what happened tonight. And the relationships you've maintained for 15 years are going to understand what you built them on." She kept her voice even. The rain on her face, the wind pulling at the wet fabric of the gown, the blood dried on the side of her head. "So what you have right now is this. You can do this the way you want to do everything, which is to make a decision without asking anyone else's permission, or you can wait for it to happen to you." Mare was quiet. His 2 men near the helipad were looking at the 6 men spread across the west end of the roof, doing the math that was available to do. The wind crossed the roof and the rain came down, and the city below went about its business 14 floors below all of it. And Cassian Mare, who had arranged the deaths of children and the erasure of a girl and the careful construction of a legitimate face over 40 years of illegitimate work, stood in the rain on the roof of the Blackbriar Grand and looked at the woman in the ruined crimson gown and the old man with the silver hair, and made the only calculation left to him that produced a different answer than the one he'd been carrying all. Mare put his hands up, not dramatically. Not the way surrender looks in the versions of this story where the villain has been waiting for the right moment to make it cinematic. He put his hands up the way a man puts them up when the arithmetic has finally run out. Slowly, from the sides, palms out, a gesture that had no theater in it, only the exhausted practicality of a person who has reached the end of a very long road and found it ending here, on a wet rooftop in the rain, with the city going about its business 14 floors below and nothing left to calculate. His 2 men near the helipad read it and stood down. Elena watched it happen and felt nothing she expected to feel. She'd thought there would be something, relief, or the specific satisfaction of a thing completed, or at minimum the adrenaline crash that comes after the body has been running on emergency chemistry for too long. What she felt instead was the rain. The cold of it, working through the gown, which was ruined beyond any reasonable repair. The particular ache of her collarbone every time her chest moved. The dried blood on the side of her face pulling at her skin as her expression changed. Aldrich's men moved in. Professional, quick. The work of people who had done this kind of thing and understood that the moment of surrender was also the most dangerous moment, the moment when someone might decide that going quietly was worse than the alternative. They didn't give Mare or his men the space to make that decision. Within 45 seconds, the situation on the roof had a clarity it hadn't had 2 minutes ago. Aldrich crossed to where Elena was standing. He stopped in front of her, looked at her face, at the blood, the swelling, the rain-soaked ruin of her hair. His expression did something she was too tired to interpret precisely. "Are you—" he started. "Don't ask if I'm all right," she said. "I'm standing. That's the answer." He was quiet for a moment. The rain came down between them. "Yes," he said finally. "That's enough." "Passem." They brought Mare down through the west stairwell and into the hotel's security office on the 2nd floor, which was a room Elena had walked past 400 times without registering it existed. One of those spaces that a building keeps out of the sight lines of the people moving through it, necessary and invisible. The room had monitors, a desk, 2 chairs, and a 3rd chair they put Mare in. His hands were secured behind him with the kind of practical efficiency that didn't require explanation. Elena sat in the corner, not because anyone had told her to sit, because her legs had finally made a non-negotiable case for it, and the corner of the security office had a section of wall that she could put her back against, which her body had decided was a requirement. Aldrich stood across from Mare. The other men arranged themselves near the door and the monitors. One of them, she didn't know his name, hadn't asked, had a phone out and was making a call in a language she didn't speak, low and continuous. 23 years, Aldrich said. He said it without preamble. Not an accusation, not a question. A statement of a fact that he was examining the way you examine something that has been handed back to you after a very long absence, trying to understand what time has done to it. Mayor looked at him. His white hair was wet from the roof. He was, she thought, genuinely handsome for a man of 70. The kind of face that had been built for authority and had grown into it over decades. Right now it was the face of a man who was deciding what version of himself to be for what he understood would be one of the last meaningful conversations of his life. "I believed I was right," Mayor said. "Then, I still believe the analysis was correct." The analysis. The heirs were going to inherit too much concentrated power. The families had agreed temporarily, but the next generation. I watched it building. I saw where it was going. He said it evenly. Not without emotion, but with the kind of emotion that has been managed and organized over a very long time until it resembles something close to calm. 6 children dying was... I understood what it was. I didn't consider it acceptable. I considered it necessary. And tonight was the same calculation. Different generation. He paused. The difference is that tonight I was wrong about the implementation. Darren was a variable I miscalculated. "You miscalculated a man's conscience," Elena said from the corner. Mayor looked at her. "That happens," she said, "when you run enough calculations." He studied her. "You're nothing like I expected Aldrich's granddaughter to be." "I'm a hotel housekeeper. I wasn't expecting to be anyone's granddaughter tonight. And yet here you are." "Here I am," she said, "in a ruined gown with a concussion making a strong case for my attention." She held his gaze. "You spent 23 years looking for me." "Periodically," he said, "when resources permitted." "Why?" "If I was a child who ran out of a burning building, if I didn't see anything that constituted evidence." A pause. Something moved in his face, the first thing she'd seen in it that had the quality of actual discomfort. "You knew the layout," he said, "of the warehouse." "I was a child in a burning building. I found exits. The exits were sealed. The interior had been reconfigured 3 days before the fire specifically to complicate evacuation." He looked at her. "You navigated a reconfigured interior in smoke and darkness and got 14 children out through access points that weren't on the original floor plan, which means someone showed you the layout in advance." The security office was very quiet. "Gregor," she said. "Gregor Pell was not inside that building," Mayor said. "He was outside. He couldn't have shown you anything during the fire." She understood then what he was saying, what it meant. The thing that had been sitting underneath everything else tonight, under the photograph, under the pendant, under the name Nadia Voss, clicking into place with the specific sound of a truth arriving late, but arriving complete. "Before," she said. "He showed me before." "He knew," Mayor said. "He knew what was planned. He knew the building had been reconfigured. He prepared a child, 8 years old, small enough to move through spaces adults couldn't, and he put her in that building before the fire started. He used you as his contingency plan." Mayor's voice remained even. "Gregor Pell didn't save you from the fire. He put you in it." Elena sat with that. The wall was cold against her back. Her collarbone moved with each breath. Through the door and down the hallway, and across the second floor, and through the ceiling she could hear the distant continuation of the ballroom. Voices, footsteps, the accumulated sound of a gathering that was still in progress, still trying to locate its equilibrium after the evening it had had. She thought about Gregor Pell, whom she had never met and would never meet, who had died 4 years ago with his secrets mostly intact, who had spent 23 years explaining to a woman in a plain dark dress that he had hidden a girl to protect her, which was true, and had apparently omitted the part that came before the hiding. She thought about the older woman in the tunnel, Sister Margaret, the woman who had held the lockbox, who had said Gregor did what he knew how to do, which was, it turned out, more than one thing. "The people he saved," Aldrich said. He was looking at Mare, but Elena understood he was also talking to her. "Whatever his method, they're alive." "Yes," Mare said, "they are. Which is why you're here, and I'm in this chair." He looked down at his own hands, or where his hands would have been if he could see them. "I've thought about that often, the specificity of the irony." "It's not irony," Elena said. "It's just what happened." Mare looked at her. "One person made one decision," she said. Gregor put a kid in a building, and the kid did what kids do when they're scared and there are other scared kids around them. Nothing cosmic about it. Just a man making a bad decision for a decent reason, and an 8-year-old doing the thing in front of her. She paused. You spent 40 years treating it like a strategic problem. It was just people. The room was quiet again. Mayer said nothing, but something in his face had changed. Not broken, not reformed, nothing as clean as that. Just changed the way things change when a very long argument finally reaches the point where both parties have run out of ammunition and are left with only the fact of each other. The summit reconvened at 2 in the morning. Not in the ballroom. The ballroom was, at this point, a crime scene of several overlapping varieties, and the process of making it otherwise was going to take time that nobody present had. They reconvened in the hotel's private dining room on the 3rd floor, which could accommodate 40 people in reasonable comfort and 400 in the standing room configuration that they arrived at by removing all the furniture except the chairs, which were arranged in a rough circle at Aldrich's instruction. Elena stood at the edge of it. Grace, the catering supervisor, the woman with the pins and the lacquer and the professional assessment, found her in the hallway outside and handed her a glass of water and looked at her face and said, "You need a hospital." Later, that's what people say before they collapse. "I'm not going to collapse." Grace looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back inside, returned with a folded cloth that was cold and damp, and pressed it against the swelling on the side of Elena's head with the same efficient care she'd applied to the gown and the hair and the lipstick, which felt like something from a different century, even though it had been 4 hours ago. "Thank you," Elena said. "Don't thank me. Go to the hospital after this." "After this?" Elena agreed. She held the cloth to her head and looked through the open doorway at the circle of chairs. She watched the men filing in. Every man she had seen from the top of the staircase, minus the security teams who were occupied with other matters, and plus the contingent that had come with Aldrich through the west roof door. They were arranging themselves in the circle without hierarchy, which was, she understood, a significant thing in a room full of people for whom hierarchy was ordinarily the organizing principle of every interaction. Aldrich stood at the center. He was wet from the roof still, his silver hair darker with rain, his suit ruined in a more expensive way than her gown. He was talking to a man she didn't recognize, mid-50s, compact, the bearing of someone who had not spent his career at tables, but had spent enough time at them to know how they worked. She watched them talk without being able to hear what was said. Then Aldrich turned and looked at her through the doorway. He didn't wave her in. He didn't gesture. He just looked at her with the expression she'd been trying to name all evening. The one that had been on his face when she'd reached the base of the staircase. The one she'd seen again on the roof. She had it now. It was the expression of a man looking at something he thought was gone and understanding, still incompletely, that it wasn't. She went inside. Nobody called the gathering to order. It called itself to order, the way rooms do when the people in them understand without instruction what the shape of the next hour needs to be. Aldrich spoke first. Not long. He was not a man who confused length with importance. He explained what had happened in the basement and on the roof in the efficient summary of someone who has been delivering operational reports his entire adult life. He said Cassian Mayer's name once, and the effect it had on the room was specific and immediate. Not surprised, she noted, in most faces. In most faces, what she saw was the particular expression of a suspicion finally confirmed, the grim satisfaction of having been right about something you wished you'd been wrong about. When Aldrich finished, 3 men spoke in sequence, and then 2 more, and the room began the work of a reckoning. Not the loud reckoning of people in the early stages of anger, but the low, thorough reckoning of people who are past anger and into the colder place where decisions get made. Elena sat and listened. She spoke twice, once when Aldrich asked her to describe the basement devices, and once when a man across the circle asked her directly what Darren had said before she cut the secondary relay. Both times she answered with the same precision she'd applied to the situation itself, the relevant facts, in order, without editorializing. Nobody asked her who she was. Aldrich had told them before the meeting, she understood. The information had preceded her into the room and settled there, and what she felt from the circle was not the shock of the ballroom, not the wave of recognition passing through 400 men, but something quieter and more considered. Something that had been given time, even the small amount of time available, to become something other than pure reaction. An older man across the circle, and she had not caught his name, would not catch it tonight, leaned forward in his chair at a pause in the discussion and looked at her and said simply, "The exit's at Harwick Street, the north corridor." She looked at him. "My daughter," he said. She was 7. Elena didn't know what to say to that. She had no memory of Harwick Street. She had the photograph, the pendant, the account of an old woman in a tunnel, and the abstract fact of a thing she had apparently done and could not remember doing. She didn't have the thing itself. "I didn't know her," she said carefully. "I don't remember any of it." "I know." He sat back. "She's 43 years ago this November. She teaches mathematics." He looked at his hands. "I'm telling you so you know." She nodded. He nodded back. Around the circle, in the small pauses between the work the room was doing, other men found small ways to do the same thing. Not speeches, not gestures, not the performance of gratitude. Just moments. A man who refilled her water glass without being asked. A man who moved his chair slightly so the draft from the ventilation above wasn't hitting her directly. The man to her right, who at some point she realized had placed himself between her and the door in the specific positioning of someone who has decided, without announcement, to be between a particular person and the direction from which threats might come. Small things. The accumulated weight of them was significant. At 4 in the morning, Aldrich walked her to the east stairwell. They were alone. She had told the man to her right that she didn't need accompaniment, and he had accepted this with the quiet dignity of a man who understood the difference between protection and surveillance. Aldrich walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, and his ruined suit, and the rain still in his hair, which had dried into something that looked like what distinguished silver hair looks like at the end of a very long night. At the door to the stairwell he stopped. She stopped too. They stood in the hallway. The same marble hallway she had walked at 20 past 10 with a bad-wheeled cart and a double shift behind her and 2 more hours ahead of her, a hallway that looked exactly as it had then, except for the altered light of 4 in the morning and the absence of any other person. And the thing between them was large enough to require acknowledgement and complicated enough that neither of them had found the language for it yet. "There are things we need to discuss," Aldrich said. "When you're ready." "I know. The birth records, your mother, what I know of her, what I should have—" He stopped, organized himself. "There are things I should have done differently. I'm aware of that. You didn't know I existed. I should have known. I should have found her sooner. She ran because she was afraid of what our life was, and she was right to be afraid, and I should have given her a reason not to be." He said it without self-pity, which made it land harder. These are old failures. They don't become smaller because they're old. She looked at the marble floor. At the pattern of it, the same pattern she'd walked across twice a day for 4 years without ever examining it. The kind of pattern that required a very specific circumstance to make visible. "Gregor put me in that building," she said. "I know. Margaret told me when I spoke with her tonight. He used an 8-year-old child as an operational asset." "Yes. And he spent the rest of his life making sure she was safe, and didn't tell her any of it." "Yes." She looked up. "I don't know what to do with that." "No," Aldrich said. "Neither do I. I've been trying to sort it for the last 2 hours, and I haven't got there." He looked at her, steadily, directly, the way he'd looked at her across the table in the ballroom, with the patience of a man who had been waiting long enough that a little more waiting was not a hardship. "I think it may be the kind of thing that doesn't get sorted, that you just carry." "I'm familiar with that kind of thing," she said. "I know." He paused. "You've been carrying quite a lot, it seems, without knowing most of what you were carrying." She thought about the pendant in the lockbox, the melted silver bird, the photograph of a child assessing a situation. She thought about Hector's face in the tunnel, and Grace with the damp cloth, and Sister Margaret on the bottom step of the staircase, with her hands folded on a box she'd been holding for 4 years in case the time came. She thought about a cart with a bad wheel. "I need to call the hospital," she said. Grace has been very firm about the concussion. Something moved in Aldrich's face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. The thing a face does when it reaches the end of a very long night and finds something unexpectedly small and human waiting there. "I'll have someone drive you," he said. "I can call a cab." "Elena." She looked at him. "Let me have someone drive you," he said. She considered this. The offer and what it meant, and the many complicated layers of what it meant, and the fact that her head hurt and her collarbone hurt, and the shoes were half a size too small, and she had been awake for 22 hours and she was 31 years old, and she had spent her entire life not belonging to anything. And tonight the belonging had arrived in the worst possible packaging, expensive and violent and irreversible, and she was going to have to decide what to do with it. Not tonight. Tonight she was going to the hospital, and she was going to have someone look at the swelling, and she was going to sit in a room that smelled like antiseptic and was lit with fluorescence that flickered the same way the basement tunnel had flickered, and she was going to let her body do what it needed to do after the night it had had. But the decision would be there when she was done. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." Aldrich nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket. The same jacket, the same motion as the folded newspaper, which felt like something from a different chapter of the same very long night, and produced the pendant, the melted silver bird on its broken chain. He held it out. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. It was lighter than she expected, the way the box had been lighter than she expected. She held it in her palm and looked at the bird shape, stylized, abstract, the wings suggested rather than rendered, the body of it partially lost to whatever heat had reached it in the warehouse and partially preserved. She thought about a child keeping this for 23 years without knowing what it was or why she kept it. She thought about the particular stubbornness of objects, the way they persist through fires and erasures and careful dismantlings of identity and just keep being what they are, patient and indifferent, waiting to be recognized. She closed her fingers around it. "Get some sleep," she said to Aldrich. "You look like a man who hasn't slept in a long time." 30 years, approximately," he said. She pushed the stairwell door open, looked back once. He was standing in the marble hallway in his ruined suit with his hands in his pockets, and the look on his face was the one she'd finally named, the one she'd been working toward all evening without knowing it. It was not the shock of recognition. It was not the careful patience of waiting. It was something that came after both of those things, the expression that arrives when the thing you thought was lost turns out to have been somewhere the whole time, doing its own work, surviving in its own way, and you are left to reconcile the version you imagined with the one that actually came back. She let the door close. The east stairwell at 4 a.m. was concrete and fluorescent and quiet, in the way that places are quiet when the events that filled them have moved elsewhere and left only the echo. She walked down 14 floors in the 2 small shoes and the ruined gown with the pendant in her closed fist, and her footsteps on the stairs were the same sound they'd been on the way up. Sharp, deliberate, carrying, except slower now, the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and is not in danger of missing it. At the 2nd floor, she paused on the landing, opened her fist and looked at the pendant. The silver bird, partial and imperfect, with the chain broken and the surface fused where the heat had reached it. She turned it over. On the back, in very small letters she hadn't noticed until now, a name engraved in a script that had survived the fire better than the face of the bird. Nadia. She held it for a long time. Then she put it in her pocket, the small pocket in the lining of the gown that she'd found hours ago while adjusting the fabric, the pocket that no one sees in a crimson evening gown because it isn't supposed to be used for anything, because the gown is supposed to be a surface and not a container, which was a design philosophy that Elena Cross had never had much patience for. She kept walking. At the lobby level, a man she didn't recognize was waiting near the service entrance with the quiet stance of someone who has been told to wait for someone and intends to do it correctly. He looked at her when she came through the door, at the gown, the dried blood, the swelling, the hair half down from the wreckage of Grace's pins, and his expression did the thing she'd seen on many faces tonight, the careful recalibration in the presence of something that didn't match the category it had been assigned. He opened the door. Outside, the storm had moved through. The city was wet and still, and the air had the specific quality of 4:30 in the morning after rain. The smell of pavement and drainage, and the particular cold that comes when the cloud cover breaks and the temperature drops into whatever it had been holding back. The street was empty except for the car, which was black and plain and waiting. She got in. The driver didn't speak. The city moved past the windows in the way cities move at this hour, the lights of it continuous and indifferent, the storefronts dark, the intersections emptied of everything except the mathematics of the signal lights cycling through their sequence for no one. She watched it and felt the pendant in her pocket and the collarbone moving with each breath and the swelling on the side of her head and the pull of the dried blood at the corner of her face, and she thought about none of it specifically. She let it be what it was, the accumulated weight of a night that had started with a bad wheel on a cart and ended with a name engraved in silver that had survived a fire she couldn't remember. The hospital came into view ahead. The emergency entrance lit up white and ordinary, the way emergency entrances are, functional, continuous, built for the specific purpose of being there when everything else has stopped working the way it was supposed to. She put her hand on the door handle. The pendant was warm from her pocket, from her hand, from the long accumulation of the night. She held the weight of it through the fabric, small and imperfect and partially destroyed and still, after everything, itself. The car stopped. She got out into the clean air of the city after rain and walked toward the light, and the night closed behind her as quietly as it knew how.